What is property? An inquiry into the principle of right and of government, by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Chapter 3, Part 4. Labor as the efficient course of the domain of property. That inequality of powers is the necessary condition of equality of fortunes. It is objected, and this objection constitutes the second part of the Saint-Simonian and the third part of the Fourieristic maxims, that all kinds of labor cannot be executed with equal ease. Some require great superiority of skill and intelligence, and on this superiority is based the price. The artist, the savant, the poet, the statesman, are esteemed only because of their excellence, and this excellence destroys all similitude between them and other men. In the presence of these heights of science and genius, the law of equality disappears. Now, if equality is not absolute, there is no equality. From the poet we descend to the novelist, from the sculptor to the stonecutter, from the architect to the mason, and from the chemist to the cook, etc. Capacities are classified and subdivided into orders, genera, and species. The extremes of talent are connected by intermediate talents. Humanity is a vast hierarchy, in which the individual estimates himself by comparison, and fixes his price by the value placed upon his product by the public. The objection always has seemed a formidable one. It is the stumbling block of the economists as well as of the defenders of equality. It has led the former into egregious blunders, and has caused the latter to utter incredible platitudes. Gracchus Babeuf wished all superiority to be stringently repressed, and even persecuted as a social calamity. To establish his communistic edifice, he lowered all citizens to the stature of the smallest. Ignorant eclectics have been known to object to the inequality of knowledge, and I should not be surprised if some one should yet rebel against the inequality of virtue. Aristotle was banished. Socrates drank the hemlock. Epaminondas was called to account, for having proved superior in intelligence and virtue to some dissolute and foolish demagogues. Such follies will be re-enacted, so long as the inequality of fortunes justifies a populace, blinded and oppressed by the wealthy, in fearing the elevation of new tyrants to power. Nothing seems more unnatural than that which we examine too closely, and often nothing seems less like the truth than the truth itself. On the other hand, according to J. Rousseau, it takes a great deal of philosophy to enable us to observe once what we see every day. And, according to D'Alembert, the ordinary truths of life make but little impression on men, unless their attention is especially called to them. The father of the school of economists, say, from whom I borrow these two quotations, might have profited by them, but he who laughs at the blind should wear spectacles, and he who notices him is near-sighted. Strange, that which has frightened so many minds is not, after all, an objection to equality; it is the very condition on which equality exists. Natural inequality, the condition of equality of fortunes! What a paradox! I repeat my assertion, that no one may think I have blundered. Inequality of powers is the sine qua non of equality of fortunes. There are two things to be considered in society: functions and relations. 1. Functions. Every laborer is supposed to be capable of performing the task assigned to him, or, to use a common expression, every workman must know his trade. The workman equal to his work, there is an equation between functionary and function. In society, functions are not alike. There must be, then, different capacities. Further, certain functions demand greater intelligence and powers, and there are people of superior mind and talent. For the performance of work necessarily involves a workman. From the need springs the idea, and the idea makes the producer. We only know what our senses long for and our intelligence demands. We have no keen desire for things of which we cannot conceive, and the greater our powers of conception, the greater our capabilities of production. Thus functions arising from needs, needs from desires, and desires from spontaneous perception and imagination, the same intelligence which imagines can also produce. Consequently no labor is superior to the laborer. In a word, if the function calls out the functionary, it is because the functionary exists before the function. Let us admire nature's economy. With regard to these various needs which she has given us, and which the isolated man cannot satisfy unaided, nature has granted to the race a power refused to the individual. She gives rise to the principle of the division of labor, a principle founded on the speciality of vocations. The satisfaction of some needs demands of man continual creation, while others can, by the labor of a single individual, be satisfied for millions of men through thousands of centuries. For example, the need of clothing and food requires perpetual reproduction, while a knowledge of the system of the universe may be acquired for ever by 2 or 3 highly gifted men. The perpetual current of rivers supports our commerce, and runs our machinery, but the sun, alone in the midst of space, gives light to the trade world. Nature, who might create Platos and Virgils, Newtons and Cuviers, as she creates husbandmen and shepherds, does not see fit to do so, choosing rather to proportion the rarity of genius to the duration of its products, and to balance the number of capacities by the competency of each one of them. I do not inquire here whether the distance which separates one man from another, in point of talent and intelligence, arises from the deplorable condition of civilization, nor whether that which is now called the inequality of powers would be in an ideal society anything more than a diversity of powers. I take the worst view of the matter, and, that I may not be accused of tergiversation and evasion of difficulties, I acknowledge all the inequalities that any one can desire. [Footnote: I cannot conceive how any one dares to justify the inequality of conditions by pointing to the base inclinations and propensities of certain men. Whence comes this shameful degradation of heart and mind to which so many fall victims, if not from the misery and abjection into which property plunges them? End of footnote. Certain philosophers, in love with the levelling idea, maintain that all minds are equal, and that all differences are the result of education. I am no believer, I confess, in this doctrine, which, even if it were true, would lead to a result directly opposite to that desired. For, if capacities are equal, whatever be the degree of their power, as no one can be coerced, there are functions deemed coarse, low, and degrading, which deserve higher pay; a result no less repugnant to equality than to the principle. To each capacity according to its results. Give me, on the contrary, a society in which every kind of talent bears a proper numerical relation to the needs of the society, and which demands from each producer only that which his special function requires him to produce, and, without impairing in the least the hierarchy of functions, I will deduce the equality of fortunes. This is my second point. 2. Relations. In considering the element of labor, I have shown that in the same class of productive services, the capacity to perform a social task being possessed by all, no inequality of reward can be based upon an inequality of individual powers. However, it is but fair to say that certain capacities seem quite incapable of certain services, so that, if human industry were entirely confined to one class of products, numerous incapacities would arise, and consequently the greatest social inequality. But everybody sees, without any hint from me, that the variety of industries avoids this difficulty. So clear is this, that I shall not stop to discuss it. We have only to prove, then, that functions are equal to each other, just as laborers who perform the same function are equal to each other. Property makes man a eunuch, and then reproaches him for being nothing but dry wood, a decaying tree. Are you astonished that I refuse to genius, to knowledge, to courage, in a word, to all the excellencies admired by the world, the homage of dignities, the distinctions of power and wealth? It is not I who refuse it, it is economy, it is justice, it is liberty. Liberty! For the first time in this discussion, I appeal to her. Let her rise in her own defence and achieve her victory. Every transaction ending in an exchange of products or services may be designed as a commercial operation. Whoever says commerce says exchange of equal values; for if the values are not equal, and the injured party perceives it, he will not consent to the exchange, and there will be no commerce. Commerce exists only among free men. Transactions may be effected between other people by violence or fraud, but there is no commerce. A free man is one who enjoys the use of his reason and his faculties, who is neither blinded by passion, nor hindered or driven by oppression, nor deceived by erroneous opinions. So, in every exchange, there is a moral obligation that neither of the contradicting parties shall gain at the expense of the other. That is, that to be legitimate and true, commerce must be exempt from all inequality. This is the first condition of commerce. Its second condition is, that it be voluntary; that is, that the parties act freely and openly. I define, then, commerce or exchange as an act of society. The negro who sells his wife for a knife, his children for some bits of glass, and finally himself for a bottle of brandy, is not free. The dealer in human flesh with whom he negotiates is not his associate, he is his enemy. The civilized laborer who bakes a loaf that he may eat a slice of bread, who builds a palace that he may sleep in a stable, who weaves rich fabrics that he may dress in rags, who produces everything that he may dispense with everything, is not free. His employer, not becoming his associate in the exchange of salaries or services which takes place between them, is his enemy. The soldier who serves his country through fear instead of through love is not free. His comrades and his officers, the ministers or organs of military justice, are all his enemies. The peasant who hires land, the manufacturer who borrows capital, the taxpayer who pays tolls, duties, patent and license fees, personal and property taxes, etc., and the deputy who votes for them, all act neither intelligently nor freely. Their enemies are the proprietors, the capitalists, the government. Give men liberty, enlighten their minds, that they may know the meaning of their contracts, and you will see the most perfect equality in exchanges, without regard to superiority of talent and knowledge. And you will admit that in commercial affairs, that is, in the sphere of society, the word superiority is void of sense. Let Homer sing his verse. I listen to this sublime genius, in comparison with whom I, a simple herdsman, an humble farmer, am as nothing. What indeed, if product is to be compared with product, are my cheeses and my beans in the presence of this Iliad? But if Homer wishes to take from me all that I possess, and make me his slave in return for his inimitable poem, I will give up the pleasure of his lays, and dismiss him. I can do without his Iliad, and wait, if necessary, for the Aeneid. Homer cannot live 24 hours without my products. Let him accept then the little that I have to offer, and when his muse may instruct, encourage, and console him. What do you say that such should be the condition of one who sings of gods and men? Alms, with the humiliation and suffering which they bring to them, what barbarous generosity! Do not get excited, I beg of you. Property makes of a poet either a Croesus or a beggar. Only equality knows how to honor and praise him. What is his duty? To regulate the right of the singer and the duty of the listener. To notice this point, which is a very important one to the solution of the question. Both are free, and one to sell, the other to buy. Henceforth their respective pretensions go for nothing, and the estimate, whether fair or unfair, that they place, the one upon his verse, the other upon his liberality, can have no influence upon the conditions of the contract. We must no longer, in making our bargains, weigh talent; we must consider products only. In order that the bard of Achilles may get his due reward, he must first make himself wanted. That done, the exchange of his verse for a fee of any kind, being a free act, must be at the same time a just act; that is, the poet's fee must be equal to his product. Now, what is the value of this product? Let us suppose, in the first place, that his Iliad, this chef d'oeuvre that is to be equitably rewarded, is really above price, that we do not know how to appraise it, &c. If the public, who are free to purchase it, refuse to do so, it is clear that, the poem being unexchangeable, its intrinsic value will not be diminished, but that its exchangeable value, or its productive utility, will be reduced to zero, will be nothing at all. Then we must seek the amount of wages to be paid between infinity on the one hand and nothing on the other, at an equal distance from each other. Since all rights and liberties are entitled to equal respect, in other words, it is not the intrinsic value, but the relative value, of the thing sold that needs to be fixed. The question grows simpler: what is this relative value? To what reward does a poem like the Iliad entitle its author? The first business of political economy, after fixing its definitions, was the solution of this problem. Now, not only has it not been solved, but it has been declared insoluble. According to the economists, the relative or exchangeable value of things cannot be absolutely determined; it necessarily varies. The value of a thing, says Say, is a positive quantity, but only for a given moment. It is its nature to perpetually vary, to change from one point to another. Nothing can fix it absolutely, because it is based on needs and means of production which vary with every moment. These variations complicate economical phenomena, and often render them very difficult of observation and solution. I know no remedy for this. It is not in our power to change the nature of things. Elsewhere Say says, and repeats, that value being based on utility, and utility depending entirely on our needs, whims, customs, &c., value is as variable as opinion. Now, political economy being the science of values, of their production, distribution, exchange, and consumption, if exchangeable value cannot be absolutely determined, how is political economy possible, and how can it be a science? How can two economists look at each other in the face without laughing? How dare they insult metaphysicians and psychologists? What! that fool of a Descartes imagined that philosophy needed an immovable base, an aliquid inconcusum, on which the edifice of science might be built, and he was simple enough to search for it. And the Hermes of economy, Trismegistus Say, devoting half a volume to the amplification of that solemn text, Political Economy is a Science, has the courage to affirm immediately afterwards, that this science cannot determine its object; which is equivalent to saying that it is without a principle or foundation. He does not know then, the illustrious Say, the nature of a science, or rather, he knows nothing of the subject which he discusses. Say's example has borne its fruits. Political economy, as it exists at present, resembles ontology, discussing effects and causes. It knows nothing, explains nothing, decides nothing. The ideas honored with the name of economic laws are nothing more than a few trifling generalities. to which the economists thought to give an appearance of depth by clothing them in high-sounding words. As for the attempts that have been made by the economists to solve social problems, all that can be said of them is, that, if a glimmer of sense occasionally appears in their lucubrations, they immediately fall back into absurdity. For 25 years political economy, like a heavy fog, was weighed upon France, checking the efforts of the mind and seeking limits to liberty. Has every creation of industry a venal, absolute, unchangeable, and consequently legitimate and true value? Yes. Can every product of man be exchanged for some other product of man? Yes, again. And how many nails is a pair of shoes worth? If we can solve this appalling problem, we shall have the key of the social system for which humanity has been searching for 6,000 years. In the presence of this problem, the economist recoils confused. The peasant who can neither read nor write replies without hesitation, as many as can be made in the same time, and with the same expense. The absolute value of a thing, then, is its cost in time and expense. How much is a diamond worth, which costs only the labor of picking it up? Nothing. It is not a product of man. How much will it be worth when cut and mounted? The time and expense which it has cost the laborer. Why then is it sold at so high a price? Because men are not free. Society must regulate the exchange and distribution of the rarest things, as it does that of the most common ones, in such a way that each may share in the enjoyment of them. What then is the value which is based upon opinion, delusion, injustice, and robbery? By this rule it is easy to reconcile everybody. If the mean term which we are searching for between an infinite value and no value at all is expressed in the case of every product, by the amount of time and expense which the product cost, a poem which has cost its author 30 years of labor, and an outlay of 10,000 francs in journeys, books, etc., must be paid for by the ordinary wages received by a laborer during 30 years, plus 10,000 francs indemnity for expense incurred. Suppose the whole amount to be 50,000 francs. If the society which gets the benefit of the production include 1,000,000 of men, my share of the debt is 5 centimes. That gives rise to a few observations. 1. The same product, at different times and in different places, may cost more or less of time and outlay. In this view, it is true that value is a variable quantity. But this variation is not that of the economists, who place in their list of the causes of the variation of values not only the means of production, but taste, caprice, fashion, and opinion. In short, the true value of a thing is invariable in its algebraic expression, although it may vary in its monetary expression. 2. The price of every product in demand should be its cost in time and outlay, neither more nor less. Every product not in demand is a loss to the producer, a commercial non-value. 3. The ignorance of the principle of evaluation, and the difficulty under any circumstances of applying it, is the source of commercial fraud, and one of the most potent causes of the inequality of fortunes. 4. To reward certain industries and pay for certain products, a society is needed which corresponds in size with the rarity of talents, the costliness of the products, and the variety of the arts and sciences. If, for example, a society of 50 farmers can support a schoolmaster, it requires 100 for a shoemaker, 150 for a blacksmith, 200 for a tailor, etc. If the number of farmers rises to 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, etc., as fast as their numbers increase, that of the functionaries which are earliest required must increase in the same proportion, so that the highest functions become possible only in the most powerful societies. [Footnote: How many citizens are needed to support a professor of philosophy? 35 millions. How many for an economist? 2 billions. and for a literary man who is neither a savant, nor an artist, nor a philosopher, nor an economist, and who writes newspaper novels? None. That is the peculiar feature of capacities. The character of genius, the seal of its glory, cannot arise and develop itself, except in the bosom of a great nation. But this physiological condition, necessary to the existence of genius, adds nothing to its social rights. Far from that, the delay in its appearance proves that, in economical and civil affairs, the loftiest intelligence must submit to the equality of possessions; an equality which is anterior to it, and of which it constitutes the crown. This is severe on our pride, but it is an inexorable truth. And here psychology comes to the aid of social economy, giving us to understand that talent and material recompense have no common measure; that, in this respect, the condition of all producers is equal; consequently, that all comparison between them, and all distinction in fortunes, is impossible. In fact, every work coming from the hands of man, compared with the raw material of which it is composed, is beyond price. In this respect, the distance is as great between a pair of wooden shoes and the trunk of a walnut tree, as between a statue by Scopas and a block of marble. The genius of the simplest mechanic exerts as much influence over the materials which he uses, as does the mind of a Newton over the inert spheres whose distances, volumes, and revolutions he calculates. You ask for talent and genius a corresponding degree of honor and reward. Fix for me the value of a woodcutter's talent, and I will fix that of Homer. If anything can reward intelligence, it is intelligence itself. That is what happens when various classes of producers pay to each other a reciprocal tribute of admiration and praise. But if they contemplate an exchange of products with a view to satisfying mutual needs, this exchange must be effected in accordance with a system of economy which is indifferent to considerations of talent and genius, and whose laws are deduced, not from vague and meaningless admiration, but from a just balance between debit and credit; in short, from commercial accounts. Now that no one may imagine that the liberty of buying and selling is the sole basis of the equality of wages, and that society's sole protection against superiority of talent lies in a certain force of inertia which has nothing in common with right, I shall proceed to explain why all capacities are entitled to the same reward, and why a corresponding difference in wages would be an injustice. I shall prove that the obligation to stoop to the social level is inherent in talent, and on this very superiority of genius I will found the equality of fortunes. I have just given the negative argument in favor of rewarding all capacities alike. I will now give the direct and positive argument. Listen, first, to the economist. It is always pleasant to see how he reasons, and how he understands justice. Without him, moreover, without his amusing blunders and his wonderful arguments, we should learn nothing. Equality, so odious to the economist, owes everything to political economy. When the parents of a physician (the text says a lawyer, which is not so good an example) have expended on his education 40,000 francs, this sum may be regarded as so much capital invested in his head. It is therefore permissible to consider it as yielding an annual income of 4,000 francs. If the physician earns 30,000, there remains an income of 26,000 francs due to the personal talents given him by nature. This natural capital, then, if we assume 10 per cent as the rate of interest, amounts to 260,000 francs, and the capital given him by his parents, in defraying the expenses of his education, to 40,000 francs. The union of these two kinds of capital constitutes his fortune. Say, complete course, etc. Say divides the fortune of the physician into two parts. One is composed of the capital which went to pay for his education; the other represents his personal talents. The division is just. It is in conformity with the nature of things. It is universally admitted. It serves as the major premise of that grand argument, which establishes the inequality of capacities. I accept this premise without gratification. Let us look at the consequences. 1. Say credits the physician with 40,000 francs, the cost of his education. This amount should be entered upon the debit side of the account, for, although this expense was incurred for him, it was not incurred by him. Then, instead of appropriating these 40,000 francs, the physician should add them to the price of his product, and repay them to those who are entitled to them. Notice further that Say speaks of income instead of reimbursement, reasoning on the false principle of the productivity of capital. The expense of educating a talent is a debt contracted by this talent. From the very fact of its existence, it becomes a debtor to an amount equal to the cost of its production. This is so true and simple that, if the education of some one child in a family has cost double or triple that of his brothers, the latter are entitled to a proportional amount of the property previous to its division. There is no difficulty about this in the case of guardianship, where the estate is administered in the name of the minors. 2. That which I have just said of the obligation incurred by talent of repaying the cost of its education does not embarrass the economist. The man of talent, he says, inheriting from his family, inherits, among other things, a claim to the 40,000 francs which his education costs, and he becomes, in consequence, its proprietor. But this is to abandon the right of talent, and to fall back upon the right of occupancy, which again calls up all the questions asked in Chapter 2. What is the right of occupancy? What is inheritance? Is the right of succession a right of accumulation, or only a right of choice? How did the physician's father get his fortune? Was he a proprietor, or only a usufructuary? If he was rich, let him account for his wealth. If he was poor, how could he incur so large an expense? If he received aid, what right had he to use that aid to the disadvantage of his benefactors, etc.? 3. There remains an income of 26,000 francs due to the personal talents given him by nature. Say, as quoted above. Reasoning from this premise, Say concludes that our physician's talent is equivalent to a capital of 260,000 francs. This skillful calculator mistakes a consequence for a principle. The talent must not be measured by the gain, but rather the gain by the talent. For it may happen that, notwithstanding his merit, the physician in question will gain nothing at all, in which case will it be necessary to conclude that his talent or fortune is equivalent to zero? To such a result, however, would Say's reasoning lead, a result which is clearly absurd. Now it is impossible to place a money value on any talent whatsoever, since talent and money have no common measure. On what plausible ground can it be maintained that a physician should be paid 2, 3, or 100 times as much as a peasant? An unavoidable difficulty, which has never been solved save by avarice, necessity, and oppression. Is it not thus that the right of talent should be determined? But how is it to be determined? I say first, that the physician must be treated with as much favour as any other producer; that he must not be placed below the level of others. This I will not stop to prove; but I add that neither must he be lifted above that level because his talent is collective property for which he did not pay, and for which he is ever in debt. Just as the creation of every instrument of production is the result of collective force, so also are a man's talent and knowledge the product of universal intelligence and of general knowledge slowly accumulated by a number of masters. And through the aid of many inferior industries, when the physician has paid for his teachers, his books, his diplomas, and all the other items of his educational expenses, he has no more paid for his talent than the capitalist pays for his house and land when he gives his employees their wages. The man of talent has contributed to the production of himself of a useful instrument. He has then a share in its possession, but he is not its proprietor. There exist side by side in him a free laborer and an accumulated social capital. As a laborer, he is charged with the use of an instrument, with the superintendence of a machine, namely, his capacity. As capital, he is not his own master. He uses himself, not for his own benefit, but for that of others. Even if talent did not find in its own excellence a reward for the sacrifices which it costs, still would it be easier to find reasons for lowering its reward than for raising it above the common level. Every producer receives an education, every laborer is a talent, a capacity, that is, a piece of collective property. But all talents are not equally costly. It takes but a few teachers, but a few years, and but little study to make a farmer or a mechanic. The generative effort and, if I may venture to use such language, the period of social gestation, are proportional to the loftiness of the capacity. But while the physician, the poet, the artist, and the savant produce but little, and that slowly, the productions of the farmer are much less uncertain, and do not require so long a time. Whatever be then the capacity of a man, whether his capacity is once created, it does not belong to him. Like the material fashioned by an industrious hand, it had the power of becoming, and society has given it being. Shall the vase say to the potter, I am that I am, and I owe you nothing? The artist, the savant, and the poet find their just recompense in the permission that society gives them to devote themselves exclusively to science and to art; so that in reality they do not labor for themselves, but for society which creates them, and requires them to do no other duty. Society can, if need be, do without prose and verse, music and painting, and the knowledge of the movements of the moon and stars, but it cannot live a single day without food and shelter. Undoubtedly, man does not live by bread alone. He must also, according to the gospel, live by the word of God. That is, he must love the good and do it, know and admire the beautiful, and study the marvels of nature. But in order to cultivate his mind, he must first take care of his body. The latter duty is as necessary as the former is noble. If it is glorious to charm and instruct men, it is honorable as well to feed them. When, then, society, faithful to the principle of the division of labor, entrusts a work of art or science to one of its members, allowing him to abandon ordinary labor, it owes him an indemnity for all which it prevents him from producing industrially, but it owes him nothing more. If he should demand more, society should, by refusing his services, annihilate his pretensions. Forced then, in order to live, to devote himself to labor repugnant to his nature, the man of genius would feel his weakness, and would live the most distasteful of lives. They tell of a celebrated singer who demanded of the Empress of Russia, Catherine II., 20,000 roubles for his services. "That is more than I give my field marshals," said Catherine. "Your Majesty," replied the other, "has only to make singers of her field marshals." If France, more powerful than Catherine II., should say to Mademoiselle Rachel, "You must act for 100 louis, or else spin cotton," to Monsieur Dupré, "You must sing for 2,400 francs, or else work in the vineyard," do you think that the actress, Rachel, and the singer, Dupré, would abandon the stage? If they did, they would be the first to repent it. Mademoiselle Rachel receives, they say, 60,000 francs annually from the Comédie Française. For a talent like hers, it is a slight fee. Why not 100,000 francs, 200,000 francs? Why not a civil list? What meanness! Are we really guilty of chaffering with an artist like Mademoiselle Rachel? It is said, in reply, that the managers of the theatre cannot give more without incurring a loss, that they admit the superior talent of their young associate, but that, in fixing her salary, they have been compelled to take account of the company's receipts and expenses into consideration also. That is just, but it only confirms what I have said, namely, that an artist's talent may be infinite, but that its mercenary claims are necessarily limited. On the one hand, by its usefulness to the society which rewards it; on the other, by the resources of this society, in other words, that the demand of the seller is balanced by the right of the buyer. Mademoiselle Rachel, they say, brings to the treasury of the Théâtre Français more than 60,000 francs. I admit it, but then I blame the theatre. From whom does the Théâtre Français take this money? From some curious people who are perfectly free. Yes, but the working men, the lessees, the tenants, those who borrow by pawning their possessions, from whom these curious people recover all that they pay to the theatre, are they free? And when the better part of their products are consumed by others at the play, do you assure me that their families are not in want? Until the French people, reflecting on the salaries paid to all artists, savants, and public functionaries, have plainly expressed their wish and judgment as to the matter, the salaries of Mademoiselle Rachel and all her fellow artists will be a compulsory tax extorted by violence, to reward pride and support libertinism. It is because we are neither free nor sufficiently enlightened that we submit to be cheated in our bargains, and the labourer pays the duties levied by the prestige of power and the selfishness of talent upon the curiosity of the idle, and that we are perpetually scandalized by these monstrous inequalities, which are encouraged and applauded by public opinion. The whole nation, and the nation only, pays its authors, its savants, its artists, its officials, whatever be the hands through which their salaries pass. On what basis should it pay them? On the basis